Have you ever met an HOA Karen, the one who spends her days nitpicking everything from the color of the fence to where she parks her car? If not, you're in luck. If you've ever been the victim of an HOA's abuse of power, today's story will surely make you both angry and elated. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Now, let's explore the story. 3 years ago, I made the most important decision of my life. I bought a 5-acre plot of land on the edge of Willow Creek Reserve, a quiet suburban community in Texas. What I fell in love with at first sight was not just the spaciousness, but also the old barn that sat deep within the property. It wasn't a dilapidated, useless structure. It was a sturdy, rustic building with heavy timbers and high ceilings. The barn was the reason I signed the purchase contract without giving it much thought. As an architect, I work mostly remotely and need a quiet space to focus on projects. Urban homes are never my thing. I want a place that has enough space to be creative, but still not too isolated from the community. Willow Creek Reserve seemed to have everything I needed: privacy, nature, and a civilized community. Furthermore, when talking to the real estate agent, I was assured that although my land is within the boundaries of a residential area, I would only have to abide by the minimum HOA, Homeowners Association regulations, mainly related to property maintenance, to maintain the general aesthetics. That suits me perfectly. I don't mind paying fees or following the ground rules, as long as I have the freedom to do what I want with my land. As soon as I moved in, I immediately set about renovating the warehouse, turning it into an office and personal workshop. The renovation took several months, but with each passing day I realized more and more that I had made the right decision. I kept the original wooden structure, only adding some reinforcements to ensure durability. I also installed electrical systems, insulation, and added large windows to take advantage of natural light. The interior was designed in a modern style while still retaining the rustic feel of the old warehouse, all of which reflected my tastes and needs. This space quickly became my favorite. During the workday, I spent hours here, immersed in architectural drawings, building models, and personal projects. On the weekends, I used it as a creative studio where I could experiment with new designs or simply fix a piece of furniture to my liking. The privacy of the property meant I could work at any time without disturbing anyone, and I especially loved the feeling of opening the barn door in the morning and breathing in the fresh air as I started my day. Everything went smoothly for the first 2 years. I had no trouble with the HHE, paid my dues on time, kept the grounds neat, and had little to no interaction with the council. The neighbors lived far apart, but were all friendly and respectful of each other's privacy. I thought I had found the perfect place to live, work, and enjoy life without interference. But I was wrong. With the arrival of Linda Patterson, everything changed. Before Linda took over, the Willow Creek Reserve HOA operated fairly quietly, a group of neighbors who managed common issues, ensuring the neighborhood was well maintained and no one was causing a negative impact on the community. They only sent out notices when absolutely necessary and rarely interfered with residents' private lives. I never had any trouble with them, nor did I have any reason to worry. However, in my 3rd year of living here, an internal election made Linda president of the HOA, and from there, the nightmare began. As soon as she took office, Linda assumed absolute power, imposing harsh regulations on the neighborhood that had never been strictly enforced before. She sent out violation notices for seemingly trivial offenses. Within months, several of my neighbors complained about her over-policing, but no one wanted to confront Linda directly. I didn't care until her next target was me. The first violation notice came out of nowhere. One morning, I went to get my mail and found a bright pink piece of paper taped to my mailbox, stating that my shed was an illegal structure that needed to be reviewed. I immediately thought it was ridiculous. I had proper documentation when I bought the land, and the OA had never raised the issue before. I took a picture of the notice, emailed it, and attached a copy of the paperwork proving that the shed was exempt from new construction regulations. I thought that if I just provided the proof, it would be over. But I underestimated Linda Patterson. Just 3 days later, another violation notice appeared, this time asking me to trim my front lawn because it was not up to residential standards. I checked it right away, and it was completely within the code, no problems at all. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I received more ridiculous violations. Once I was warned for putting my trash can in the wrong place, even though I always put it in the right place. Another time, I received a letter of warning for having inappropriate plants in my yard, when what I planted were native wildflowers that attract bees and butterflies for pollination. Linda even claimed that the color of the shed door was not in keeping with the overall aesthetic, even though it was completely invisible from the main road or any other houses. At first, I patiently responded to each violation, attaching evidence and citing the HOA's own bylaws to refute the allegations. But the more I did, the more Linda became difficult. I don't know if she was targeting me because I was defiant, or if she simply enjoyed power. But it was clear that she was trying to find ways to make my life a never-ending series of problems. The neighbors weren't immune to Linda's influence either. One was ordered to repaint her fence because the color was too light. Another was warned for parking on the street for too long, despite no parking regulations. But no one was targeted as much as I was. Every time I dismissed a ridiculous allegation, a new violation would pop up a few days later. Linda not only wanted to force me to follow unreasonable rules, but she also wanted absolute control, to make me bow to her power. But I was not the type of person to be bullied. I stood my ground, continued to respond with clear evidence, and although it was tiring, I had no intention of giving in. I thought that things would eventually level out, that Linda would realize that I was not so easy to manipulate and find another prey to make things difficult. But I was sorely mistaken, because just a few months later, Linda found a way to force me in another way, more blatantly, more forcefully, and this time she went too far. I thought Linda's ridiculous violations would be limited to superficial issues, overgrown grass, trash, trees. But I underestimated the extent of her control. One afternoon, while I was working in the shed, I heard footsteps in the driveway. When I opened the door, I saw Linda Patterson standing there, a thick file in her arms, her eyes cold and calculating. Without beating around the bush, she announced that she had reviewed my shed records and found a serious problem. She said that while the structure of the shed might be exempt, my use of it as a personal office and workshop was not in keeping with the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and therefore she needed to inspect the interior to ensure I was in compliance with HOA regulations. I could hardly believe my ears. My warehouse was hundreds of feet from the main road, hidden behind a dense row of trees. No one could see inside, so how could it affect the general aesthetics? I was used to Linda's ridiculousness, but this time she went further. She wanted to enter my private space, no longer stopping at just the silly outdoor regulations. I refused immediately, explaining that the HOA only had the authority to monitor the exterior appearance, not to require an inspection of the interior, as per their bylaws. But Linda was not going to give up easily. She insisted that the HOA had the authority to regulate all construction in the community, and if I did not allow the inspection, she would initiate a formal review, which could result in fines and required renovations. I knew I was dealing with someone who would bend the rules to her liking, but fortunately I was not one to be intimidated. Before Linda could go any further, I pulled out the land purchase agreement and the waiver I had kept since day one. I showed her the clear waiver for the shed, asserting that the HOA had no right to interfere with how I used the interior space. Linda skimmed the document, but it was clear to me that she didn't care about the legality of it. She didn't really want to address the issue legally, but rather wanted control. When she realized I had enough evidence to disprove the charges, she changed tactics, starting to mock me for using the warehouse as an unauthorized commercial facility, implying that my remote work violated HOA rules. This is when I realized what she really wanted. Linda didn't just want to inspect me. She wanted to find a way to force me to change, maybe force me to clean up, repair, or even not use the shed the way I wanted. If she couldn't do that through HOA rules, she would purposely create new reasons to make my life more difficult. I kept my cool, reminded her once again that the HOA had no right to inspect the interior, and advised her to read their own bylaws. Linda couldn't do anything right away, but I knew this wouldn't be the last time she tried to interfere with my property. She had no valid reason, but that had never stopped her before. I thought that after being so clearly dismissed, Linda might look for another target in the neighborhood to harass, but I was wrong. Because just a few days later, I received a new set of violations, this time not just for the shed, but for weeds, plants, and even noise from my workshop. I began to realize that these weren't just unreasonable bylaws, but that this was a war that Linda had declared on me, and she had no intention of stopping. The first notice arrived on Monday morning, claiming that my lawn was over the permitted height. This was completely untrue. I always kept my lawn neat and tidy, and I never let it grow too much. But Linda clearly didn't care about the facts. She just needed a reason to keep up the pressure. I responded by taking pictures of my lawn, attaching a copy of the HOA bylaws, and sending an email refuting the allegations. I thought that would be the end of it, but 2 days later I received another notice. This time the HOA claimed that I had inappropriate plants in my yard. I looked through the list of prohibited plants and found none of them in my yard. What I had planted were simply native wildflowers that attract bees and butterflies for pollination, and were not in violation of any regulations. But that didn't stop Linda from sending me a notice demanding that I remove them all within 14 days or face a fine. Less than a week later, I received a new complaint, this time about noise from my shed. Linda claimed that several neighbors had complained about my noisy use of machinery and tools at night, disturbing the peace and quiet of the neighborhood. This was completely unfounded, as my closest neighbors were at least a quarter-mile away, and I had always kept reasonable hours and did not use machinery at night or early in the morning. I emailed her asking for proof of these complaints, but of course there was no response other than a warning that, if the violations continued, I could face formal charges. Linda also started targeting more personal things, like how I parked my car in my yard. And one day, I received a notice that I was in violation of an HOA rule for parking on an unauthorized surface. I checked the document and found that the rule only applied to the community's public streets, while I had only parked in my own private driveway. When I sent a response with photos to prove that I was not in violation, Linda did not respond, but a few days later, a new violation popped up. I slowly realized that this was no longer a random warning or a simple management mistake. This was a deliberate war. Linda didn't care if I was actually in violation or not. She was deliberately creating problems, hoping that by wearing me down, I would give in and do what she wanted. My neighbors began to feel the effects too, though none were as targeted as I was. One neighbor was ordered to repaint her fence because the HOA thought it was an inappropriate color, and another was warned for parking her car in front of her house too long, even though there was no ordinance against it. But most people didn't want to confront Linda, so they kept quiet and complied, perhaps out of fear of being targeted by her even more. I'm not the type to succumb to a control freak. But I also knew that confronting Linda head-on in a protracted battle like this would take too much of my time and energy. I needed a different approach, a way to end this farce once and for all. I decided to spend an evening poring over all the HOA documents, learning the true limits of their powers. I needed to know exactly what Linda could and couldn't do, and if she was truly overstepping her authority, how I could fight back legally. But just when I thought I was planning to be proactive, Linda took a step forward. She was no longer satisfied with just sending me a notice of violation. She wanted an official reason to force me. And that led to the biggest and most brazen demand I'd ever received from the HOA. After weeks of dealing with unreasonable notices of violation, I'd grown accustomed to opening my mailbox and finding a bright pink piece of paper taped to the front. This time, however, what showed up on my doorstep wasn't a warning or a reminder, but an unexpected demand from the HOA. One that made me realize immediately that Linda was switching to a different tactic. Instead of continuing to pester me with petty violations, the HOA sent a formal request to use my barn as the site for the neighborhood summer party. It turned out that the community hall that was usually used for this event was undergoing renovations, and the HOA had not yet found a replacement. According to the attached document, they thought my barn was the perfect choice because of its spaciousness and rustic style, which could create a cozy, natural event. Reading that, I immediately understood Linda's intention. She not only wanted the event venue, but also used the HOA as a tool to manipulate me. She thought I would be afraid of being seen as selfish if I refused, but agreeing would mean conceding control to the HOA, which I would never accept. Without hesitation, I immediately refused. I responded by email, stating that my warehouse was private property, not HOA Commons, and that I could not risk allowing hundreds of people to enter a space filled with equipment and work materials. I also emphasized that the event had not been discussed in advance, and that it was not my responsibility to rush to find an alternative location. I knew Linda would be upset, but I did not expect her to react so violently. Within hours of my email rejection, Linda herself showed up at my door, this time accompanied by 3 other HOA members. I opened the door and immediately saw that her expression was no longer the fake authoritarianism of before, but rather a determination to force me to give in. Linda didn't beat around the bush. She announced that the board had agreed to waive any violations related to my shed, provided I allowed the HOA to use it as a party venue. I was so used to her dirty tricks that I wasn't surprised by this offer. I kept my voice level, reiterating my reasons for refusing. But instead of listening, Linda began to change her tune. She stopped offering and turned to veiled threats. With a wry smile, she hinted that refusing was not an option, that the HOA had the right to monitor all activities in the community, and that cooperating would make life easier. I immediately understood that she was implicitly warning that if I did not comply, the HOA would continue to harass me in other ways, including creating new violations, prolonging the appeal process, and even seeking legal repossession of my space. Now I was no longer dealing with a bureaucratic HOA. I was dealing with an individual who was willing to bend the rules to get what she wanted. But if Linda thought I would cave under pressure, she had picked the wrong person. I stood my ground, refusing firmly. But as Linda turned to leave, I saw anger and determination in her eyes, a silence that was more disturbing than direct threats. I knew this wasn't the end, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. I knew Linda wouldn't give up easily after I refused to let the HOA use my shed as a party venue. But I didn't expect her to go so far as to bend the rules, falsify documents, and blatantly trespass on my personal property. When I received an email from the HOA with the subject line "Notice of Emergency Board Meeting and New Decision," I immediately sensed something was amiss. I opened the email and read it line by line. It stated that the HOA had held an unannounced emergency meeting and passed a resolution to temporarily use the common area for a community event. But the most shocking part was that they had redefined the property lines, declaring part of my shed to be on land that was part of the HOA's common property. It was accompanied by a poorly edited map showing the property lines had been changed, making my shed part of the common property of Willow Creek Reserve. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This wasn't just an administrative stunt or a veiled threat. This was outright fraud, an attempt to steal my property rights through forged documents. Linda had actually changed the property lines just to force me to do what she wanted. I called David Hayes, an old friend and OA litigation attorney. He sighed and said that the HOA had broken the law. They couldn't unilaterally change the property lines or hold an emergency meeting without notice. David immediately drafted a letter to rescind the decision, including a legal provision that proved the HOA had overstepped its authority. I printed the letter that afternoon and mailed it to each board member. I thought this would put Linda off, but I once again underestimated her. Just a day later, I woke up and looked out the window to see the HOA right there on my property. 3 SUVs were parked next to the shed, and a group of people, including Linda, were carrying boxes of decorations, tables, chairs, and event equipment. I walked outside, my heart pounding with anger, but I tried to keep my cool. Linda turned to me with a triumphant smile, saying that they were getting ready for the party and that I had been notified, so there was no reason to object. But the worst was yet to come. When I asked them to leave my property immediately, Linda didn't panic or get flustered. She simply walked to the shed door, pulled out a set of keys, and opened the door. I felt my body heat with anger as the shed door swung open in front of me. She had a key. It couldn't be. I had never given a key to anyone, except when I asked a garage door repairman to help me change the lock over a year ago. I knew right away that Linda had abused my trust, forcing the repairman to make a duplicate without my permission. I knew I couldn't let this situation continue. Without hesitation, I called 911 and reported that a group of people were trespassing on my private property. As I was calling, Linda was still blatantly directing others to move items into the shed, as if she actually believed she had the right to do so. Less than 20 minutes later, a police car showed up. An officer got out of the car and walked over to me, listening to me explain the situation. I showed him my ownership papers, the cease and desist letter, and evidence of the HOA's forgery. After reviewing it, the officer turned to Linda and made it clear that the OA had no right to be here, that the property was my private property, and that they needed to leave immediately. No one in Linda's group said a word, except for Linda herself. Linda tried to argue that it was a misunderstanding, that she was just doing her community service, but the officer didn't care. He reiterated that if they didn't leave immediately, I had the right to sue them for trespassing and forgery. Linda had no choice but to order them to pack up and leave, but as soon as she passed me, I heard her hiss in anger. This isn't over yet. I thought that after being asked to leave my property by the police, Linda would admit defeat and find another way to host the HOA summer party. But like every time before, she refused to back down, and this time, her stubbornness led to a real disaster. The morning after the break-in, I woke up to find my phone full of messages from several neighbors reporting that the OA was setting up a party right on the main street of the community. I turned on my security camera and immediately saw a group of people busily setting up tables and chairs in the middle of Willow Creek Reserve's main street, right in front of a row of houses. The catering company's truck was parked blocking the street, and several people were bringing in decorations, speakers, and even a small stage to prepare for the event. I couldn't believe my eyes. Linda had turned the street into a party venue without permission. No one in the neighborhood had been consulted, and the HOA had ignored the authorities. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching in frustration, while a few people tried to move their cars but were blocked by HOA furniture. Although many were upset, no one dared to confront Linda. But I knew that this kind of traffic jam would eventually attract the attention of the police. Less than 2 hours later, as the event was wrapping up, I heard sirens in the distance. I looked through the camera and saw 2 police cars entering the neighborhood, lights flashing. One of the officers I'd seen the day before, Officer Rodriguez, got out of the car and walked over to Linda, who was busy instructing the caterers to set up tables and chairs. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see a clear change in Linda's demeanor. At first, she raised her hands in protest, but within minutes, her expression changed from anger to annoyance, and finally to disappointment. One of the officers raised his hand, and immediately, the event staff began clearing away the tables, chairs, speakers, and other equipment. I didn't need to be there to know that the party had been immediately shut down by the police. Not long after, I saw one of my neighbors, Jim, who was the HOA treasurer, approach Linda, clearly displeased. He said something to her, but Linda just crossed her arms and turned away in frustration. Several other residents began to gather around, and I could tell they were unhappy with the situation. I was not surprised when the police ordered all the event equipment to be removed within the hour, and also issued a ticket to the HOA for holding an illegal event, obstructing traffic, and not having a valid permit. Some of the catering staff tried to persuade Linda to move the furniture quickly, but she just stood there, muttering something indignantly. Within 30 minutes, what was supposed to be the HOA's biggest event of the year was completely canceled. The caterers loaded the vans, the residents dispersed, and in the end, all that was left was a road littered with trash and the evidence of a failed plan. Linda didn't say a word, just got into her car and drove away, but I knew she wouldn't let this go easily. I was right. That same evening, I received a text message from Jim, the HOA treasurer, asking me to attend an emergency board meeting the next morning. Without asking, I knew the subject of the meeting. Linda Patterson had finally gone too far, and now both the board and the residents were facing the consequences of her actions. The next morning, I went to the community meeting room, which was packed with residents looking tense, unlike the usual HOA meetings that were sparse. Linda sat in the center, but she was not as smug as usual. When she saw me enter, she frowned and fell silent. I sat near the front, and soon Jim opened the meeting. Jim began by explaining the reason for the meeting and Linda's recent actions that had gotten the OA into serious trouble, especially the falsification of documents, the trespassing on private property, and holding an unauthorized event that had resulted in police intervention. After going over the major violations, he let the residents share their experiences under Linda's management. One by one, people stood up to speak, and I wasn't the only one who had a problem with her. One resident complained about Linda's unreasonable violation notices to control people. Another talked about how the AOA had been sued a few months ago for Linda's discriminatory policies. An elderly couple spoke about how she had intentionally delayed their home improvement application for over a year because she didn't like the design. When it was my turn, I calmly explained the entire situation, from the unreasonable violations I had received to Linda trespassing on my property with a forged key, and finally to my being forced to call the police to protect my legal rights. I also presented evidence, including the HOA's email notice of the illegal redesignation of property lines and the camera footage of the HOA entering my shed without permission. The room fell into a tense silence as I placed the evidence on the table. Several of the panelists looked at each other, some took notes, while others frowned nervously. Linda sat still, but I could see her hands clenched so tightly they were white. Finally, one of the panelists spoke up, looking directly at Linda and asking her what she had to say about the accusations. Linda tried to take control, but this time her tone was less firm. She tried to downplay the seriousness of the situation, claiming that her actions were only to maintain order and improve the quality of life in the community. But no one believed her excuses anymore. Jim flipped through a document he had prepared in advance, listing all the violations of HOA rules Linda had committed during her tenure. These included abuse of power, personal management of the HOA, fraudulent paperwork, harassment of residents, and most seriously, falsifying property lines to force others to accept her demands. After the list of violations was published, Jim made an official motion, placing a vote of no confidence in Linda Patterson and removing her from the HOA presidency immediately. The vote was swift. The result was overwhelming, with the entire board in favor of removing Linda, and even those who had previously supported her were no longer willing to stand by her. Jim announced the final decision, and the room murmured in relief except Linda. She pounded the table, stood up, her face red with anger, and shouted that they would regret it, that the community would collapse without her. But no one listened. Security intervened, demanding that she leave. Before leaving, Linda swept her eyes around the cold room, then slammed the door behind her. And that was the end of it. After months of her unreasonable abuses, Linda was finally removed from power. The HOA now entered a new phase, and I can continue to live peacefully in my home without having to worry about her controlling tactics. I know the war with the HOA is never really over, but at least in this battle I won.